The Lord be with you. The O'Dowds greet you again at a distance. And we're now into week 2. We're in the middle of Lent, and we're in week 2 of living at a distance in this socially kind of isolating place that we're in. Wednesday, if you go back just a few days, we were halfway through Lent. So we're tracking this journey to Easter that's harder for us to gather and have our heads around as we're apart. And I'll say more about that today as I think through how we worship apart in this way that we are. Our gospel today is in John 9, and I asked people to read the whole thing together. We've read it out loud and sections of it because this whole story is this long tale of Jesus healing the man born blind. And the story is repeated 3 times, the man's testimony and Jesus' instructions. There's this repetition. John doesn't want to miss the details of the healing. But to begin today thinking about the passage, I want to go back to the beginning of the passage when Jesus is drawn to the man. It says that as they're walking, he sees the man born blind. And the disciples follow in and they ask this question: who sinned that this man was born blind? Was it him or was it his parents? The question they're asking is, why does this man suffer? Of all the people, all the humans, of all the people that walk around, why Jesus? They know he has this insight and this wisdom. And they want to know why this man has suffered the way that he has. And Jesus, typical of him, refuses the answer. He says, neither was this man a sinner or his parents, but that the works of God might be manifested in him. And Jesus will go on with his act. I want to come back to that healing moment at the end, but stay with the question for a moment. Why? Why was the man born blind? What happened that this man entered into this suffering? And it's a question that we all, I imagine, are feeling in countless ways. There are people I know who feel isolated because of this experience. They're not near to others. They lack human touch. I know friends I'm talking to around the country who've been isolated in some way. People isolated from home in their suffering, waiting at some point to come back to where they long to be. There are those who, the fear, the anticipation of the future, lost wages in work, the uncertainty of income that weighs upon us now. Why? Why would God enter us into this moment of suffering at this time? Many people feel the loss of hope denied. Sporting events and training, all these things leading up to this season being canceled one after another. The Olympics perhaps next, if they haven't been already. These experiences expected for a long time lost. Graduations and family reunions, Easter, baptisms. We've simply had this experience with an uncertain environment it's put on us. There is a writer in the Psalms, a commentator, who says that time has this ability to destroy, this destructive power to it. Things we had anticipated pulled out from under us. Things we long for, we don't know when we'll have them back again. Time is a destructive force. Proverbs 13 has this line in chapter 13, verse 10 or 12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. It weighs on us, it tears at us. We actually know now from modern psychology or cognitive science that emotional pain and suffering like this actually hurts. That's how we know it. The fact that hope has been deferred, we feel in the backs of our stomachs or our throats. Feel that empty sense of longing return because we've built up some kind of expectation, and it actually wears on our body. It can run down our immune systems. It can create depression. It can take sleep from us. And this pressure of time that's on us is real. It ought to be attended to carefully. And what I want us to think about is God's own invitation to ask the question. Jesus doesn't answer what the disciples want, but he does invite the question for us to ask why. The Psalms, in fact, call for it. Our psalm for today is Psalm 23. I often feel like I try and reinforce to the church that the book of Psalms, 150 prayers, aren't some random group of just idle prayers. The shaping of them, the authors who write them, their content, carefully strung together by those who give us this book. The Psalms, in fact, you could think of them as beads on a string that move along, and the 60s and 70s and 80s dive into darkness and lament and complaint. And they come back out in the 90s. It's that shape of these complaints and prayers and praises that I want us to draw into, because they invite us to bring before God the question why. Psalm 23 does not invite the question, you may say. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It may feel trite to you that somebody would quote that psalm to you in a moment of suffering. It's too fast, it's too quick of a simple kind of Christianese answer to a moment of hardship. And I agree, it doesn't answer well what we often feel. And in fact, Psalm 23 does not stand alone. It doesn't sit there and just come at us to provide comfort in a moment without warning. It's been carefully paired together with Psalm 22. Psalm we should know well. We'll say this psalm together and read it in a couple of weeks during Holy Week and Good Friday. The psalm is also David's. David writes this psalm for us, the Lord is my shepherd. He writes Psalm 22 just before it. My God, why? Why have you forsaken me? Why do you stand far off? David presses the question, why, at God. Before he gets to the Lord as my shepherd, he wants to spend time in complaint. He wants to bring his emotional energy before the Lord. Psalm 22 is probably 5 times longer than Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. David spends most of his energy in complaint, laying out his emotional experience, the departure of friends, his suffering. Towards the end of this middle section in Psalm 22 in David's complaint, he talks about his enemies as dogs and wild oxen and lion who've come after him. David feels the pressure, the pursuit of enemies. Move forward to Psalm 23, and it's a perfect parallel for the valley of the shadow of death. David being pursued. At the end of that little section where David's praying about his enemies after him, he turns to the congregation, to his hope of joining together with them again where he has trust, where his praise and hope and thanksgiving return to him, and that opens up into a moment of feasting with the church, with the congregation, gathered together. The table of the Lord. There it is in Psalm 23. You prepare a table for me in the presence of all my foes. The foes are present in both songs. The table is present in both psalms. The first one is David's long complaint. 2/3 of the psalm is merely the complaint that prepares us for the moment of trust and the moment of peace in Psalm 23. You make me lie down in green pastures, but not without a long moment, very often, of complaint, of bringing my suffering before you, so that I might tell you of how I feel, how the anguish has weighed down upon me. The question why is offered to us, and I bring that before us. We can enter in together into complaint, into longing for God to help heal our longings and our suffering and our pain. The Psalms don't let us stay there. They're training, they're disciplining, habituating us to complain, but to move into thanksgiving, into trust, into hope again. And it's distinct in the Psalms that moment of movement of trust and hope is almost always in the congregation, in the plural. And you may rightly ask, how do we do that in a season where we're isolated in our homes, alone, far from each other in prayer? And I do have a few ideas to share at the end of the sermon. I want to come back now to this moment in John 9, the suffering of the man born blind. A man who suffers for no reason or cause, and now Jesus enters in and becomes near to him in this moment of need. And it's important to pay attention to the details that John gives us. As I said, he tells the details of the healing in 3 times so that we don't miss how this man was healed. It says that Jesus took spit and earth and combined them and rubbed them physically, touch on the man's eyes in his suffering, and then has him wash with water, and the man's eyes are open and he sees. That Sight is always a metaphor, always an invitation for John for spiritual awakening, for an encounter of God out of a moment of darkness and blindness. And the man sees because Jesus has touched him in the moment of his suffering. John scholars pick up on these careful cues. We did these with Emma Clare during the week. John just playing around with his themes, such an artist of symbols. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things came into being through him. Through him all things were made. John is inviting us to see these themes play out, and here in John 9, think about how the man is healed with water and mud that results in light. Go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 1, on day 3. In that scene, there's water, and there's soil, and there's life. In day 4, there's light. John 9, I am the light of the world. That parallels Genesis, the light that comes on day 4. The healing with mud and dirt, day 3. The image we're supposed to get is Jesus, the Creator, is going throughout the creation and putting his hands on suffering and turning them into light and life. He's reawakening, he's forgiving from sin, he's repairing what's broken in our world and our creation and within us in our suffering. The Creator's in our midst. He's drawn near to us now to become part of his creation. In a few weeks, as I said, we'll come to the end of Lent, and we'll hear these words not as David in Psalm 22, but we'll hear them on the lips of Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why do you stand far off? It's Jesus' own voice of comfort to us. He's borne our own complaint. He's embodied our suffering for us. He's come in his love to absorb that. We should have that image of the suffering of the blind man and our suffering in this moment and the suffering of people in the past, that Jesus invites that into his flesh to sit before the Father on the cross. Every other prayer of Jesus to God is to the Father. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, Father, if it's your will, take this cup from me, but not my will. Only here does he say God. God prays to God in this dark moment of separation that Jesus is abandoned by God for the moment that the suffering comes upon him from the world. And there is no answer. There's no answer for his suffering. There was no answer for the disciples as to why this man suffered. And there is no answer for why Jesus suffers except for love, that he's present in the suffering. He's there in the moment with us, bearing it for us, transforming it like mud and water into life and light. That is the gospel message. The Creator himself has come and taken on his flesh the suffering of humanity so that we'll never have the final word of the victory. Jesus touches us in this moment by his redemptive life so that our suffering results in hope, as it did for David as he moved through his suffering in Psalm 23 to know the Lord as his shepherd who's near. Despite enemies being around, God is our hope. I'll give us these words as we come to a close in Romans chapter 5. Paul has this same kind of cycle of thought going on in his mind, and he says, for we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering brings about endurance, endurance character, and character hope. And hope doesn't disappoint because the love of God is poured out into our hearts in Jesus. That hope for us as we come through a moment of suffering, it opens up into hope because his resurrection means suffering doesn't have the final word. That what we experience now will only be made into manifest joy and glory in eternity. And that hope already dwells within us. Hope in Christian virtue is it's a desiring, it's a longing for God, a reaching, a leaning, some call it. We lean into that moment. We don't stay in the suffering and despair. We lean in with the community and say, I hope for what God has made out of this suffering because it's already begun to take part in my life and in this world because Christ is among us in our suffering. Yes, how do we do that in a moment where we can't see and hear and touch one another? There's actually in the Book of Common Prayer a time in sickness for a sacrament of desire. When the church can't gather and have communion, it can gather apart and desire the cup and complain and call out to God, gather us again. And there's hope and there's healing in the sacrament of desire. Teresa of Avila is a Spanish nun in the 16th century. She talked about spiritual communion. When I cannot have the bread and the wine in the company, I can long for them and know that God will become near to all of us by his Spirit. At a distance, we're together. In the weeks ahead, I'm going to try and create more and more spaces for us to be together through technology, to hear one another's voices and see faces. A couple of times this week, I'll probably put it out an email very soon or a video. And I'm going to invite people a couple times this week into morning prayer and to noon prayer on Zoom. And I'll probably record those sessions so that if you can't make them, you can join in and hear others' voices. If you can, call in. We'll see our faces. We'll pray together. Morning prayer maybe takes 15 minutes and noonday prayer 5 to 10. And we can pray and we can offer up our complaints and our praises and our trust. We can speak with one another through that means and begin to hear one another's voices. Pray with one another. And as we get experience, we can continue to do that, praying and calling one another so that our communion is brought together in hope. May the God of hope fill us now as we're apart. May he strengthen us in our communion. May he give us a longing and desire to eat his supper again. May he have mercy on us and on his world. And may we know his presence, that he has suffered among us as one of us. And now may the blessing of God Almighty be with you all. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.